Jesus. It's dust in my coffee. Yum yum. Oh hey, did Jesus exist? Yep. First, we'll consider the rather wrong-headed question, can you prove Jesus existed without using the Bible? The reason I call it a wrong-headed question is because whenever a skeptic qualifies the question with without using the Bible, I'm thinking you must not understand what the Bible is. And I don't mean the Bible as inspired scripture. I don't mean that you have to look at the Bible the way Christians consider the Bible. I mean the Bible as a compilation of ancient history. The Bible isn't a grand work of fiction written by some fantasist or an evil genius who desires to control the world. It's historical accounts of people, places, and events. So personally, I don't grant this silly dismissal. The Bible is the source for the life and times of Jesus, for the existence of Jesus. You know, Thomas, often referred to as Doubting Thomas, I recognize to be a bit of a reflection of us, of all those who have and will come to Jesus through hearing the gospel. Thomas didn't witness the resurrected Jesus at first. He first only heard the gospel. He only heard that Jesus had appeared, bodily resurrected from the other disciples. And what was his reaction? He was skeptical. Upon hearing this, he needed evidence. And it was only once he got that evidence, once Christ granted him that evidence, that he believed. And Jesus said, "You believe because you have seen me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me." Humans reason and seek reason, seek evidence, because God is reasonable. Faith is produced by the testimony of witnesses. We hear the testimony of witnesses, we weigh the evidence, and we reach the logical conclusion based on the evidence. It's short-sighted to throw out the Bible, to dismiss it as irrelevant and unreliable without giving it a fair trial simply because you're not a Christian. Likewise, it's short-sighted and unfair to dismiss a believer in God, whether that person is a Christian or otherwise, as ignorant or irrational or fantasists. Just realised. Ah well. But whatever. What external proof is there then for the historical Jesus without using the Bible? I'll start with a quote from everyone's favourite agnostic atheist Bible scholar, Bart Ehrman. Just to set the tone. In his book, Did Jesus Exist? He says this: "What I do hope is to convince genuine seekers who really want to know how we know that Jesus did exist, as virtually every scholar of antiquity, of biblical studies, of classics, and of Christian origins in this country and, in fact, in the Western world agrees. Many of these scholars have no vested interest in the matter. As it turns out, I myself do not either. I am not a Christian and I have no interest in promoting a Christian cause or a Christian agenda. I am an agnostic with atheist leanings, and my life and views of the world would be approximately the same whether or not Jesus existed. But as a historian, I think evidence matters, and the past matters, and for anyone to whom both evidence and past matter, a dispassionate consideration of the case makes it quite plain. Jesus did exist." Could end there, really. We have 4 points of interest. Good, strong evidence for these 4 is what we need to reckon. These are crucifixion and burial, that is, after Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, Jesus was buried in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. The empty tomb. 3 days later, the tomb was found empty by a group of Jesus' female followers. The fact that they were female is important, since the testimony of women didn't really hold up. The implication being, If you were going to make this all up, you'd say that men had witnessed this, since that would be more credible. The post-mortem appearances, or resurrection appearances. Various individuals and groups at various times in various places had experiences with the risen Jesus. They were completely convinced that they had seen, touched, spoken to, and eaten with Jesus. And lastly, a sincere belief in the resurrection, that these experiences completely transformed the disciples, that these experiences inspired a belief among them that God had raised Jesus bodily from the dead, which led to the formation of the church. Now, we're going to look at a few external sources, some pagan, some Jewish, in no particular order. Thallus. Thallus isn't regarded as good evidence. He isn't regarded as strong evidence for the historical Jesus by some, for three reasons. First, he doesn't seem to specifically mention Jesus, and his original quote is lost to time. Thirdly, the context of his quote is uncertain. So we don't have originals. What we do have are fragments of works, his works, delivered to us by others. Personally, while I recognize weaker, stronger evidences, I see no necessary reason for us to deem these works as inauthentic, because most sources quoted Thallus in order to argue with him. If you were gonna fabricate something someone said, you'd probably make them agree with you. That would make more sense. Julius Africanus is arguing against Thallus's explanation for the darkness that came over the earth after Jesus' death. Goes like this: on the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness Thallus, in the third book of his history, calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. Julius is arguing that Thallus, when writing about this darkness, wrongly attributes it to an eclipse of the sun. Now, this is on the weaker end of the spectrum. It seems to me that if these events are being discussed, if Thallus had an opinion about these events that are considered to have happened following the crucifixion of Jesus, which we can see is attested to by other accounts, that tells me that Thallus must have known who, or at least that, Jesus was. But if he's aware of the circumstances surrounding his death, he must be aware that there was a cause for the darkness, the earthquaking. Anyway, let's go to a strong source. Tacitus, Roman historian. Tacitus wrote an account of the Great Fire of Rome, which Emperor Nero blamed on Christians. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their centre and become popular. Yes, obviously Tacitus is unsympathetic to Christianity. No fooling. All the more credible then. It's helpful to note that the events Tacitus records happened around the same time the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts were written. That's only 30 or so years after Jesus' death. Furthermore, we learn stuff. The Christians being blamed were named after a person called Christus, Latin for Christ. This Christus suffered the extreme penalty, which is a reference to crucifixion. The execution was carried out by Pontius Pilate, just as we read in the New Testament, and Christianity was spreading in Judea and even in Rome. Such details corroborate the Gospels. So this recount tells us that there's a group of people called Christians who follow a man named Christ. This man suffered the extreme penalty, crucifixion, under the reign of Tiberius Caesar at the hands of Pontius Pilate. And this mischievous superstition, which is reasonably inferred to mean the resurrection, the entirety of Christianity depends on it. So lots of details here. People, places, events. It's good. Marabar Serapion. Marabar. The Syrian philosopher. Don't name him like that anymore, do they? So he's writing to his son, describing the fate of a number of philosophers and leaders of movements. An Orientalist who lived during the 1800s dates this letter to the end of the 1st century. Most scholars, though, date it 2nd century, because the author refers to the Jews as desolate and scattered, which better fits after the AD 135 revolt. What advantage did the Athenians gain from putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as a judgment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these 3 wise men. The Athenians died of hunger, the Samians were overwhelmed by the sea. The Jews, ruined and driven from their land, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates did not die for good. He lived on in the statue of Hera. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching which he had given. What did we learn? Well, Jesus existed, and that's all we really came here for. Additionally, that he was called the King of the Jews. He was killed before AD 70 and before the destruction of the temple. God justly avenged Jesus, judging the nation of Israel for rejecting him. Phlegon. These names. Like Thallus, we don't have the original work. Rather, we have another ancient source which, like Thallus, is debating Phlegon. In fact, we have multiple quotes. According to Julius Africanus, Phlegon also spoke of an eclipse. Phlegon records that in the time of Tiberius Caesar at full moon, there was a full eclipse of the sun from the 6th hour to the 9th, yada yada yada. Origen, in his work Against Celsus, confirms the same thing. And with regard to the eclipse in the time of Tiberius Caesar, in whose reign Jesus appears to have been crucified, and the great earthquakes which then took place, Phlegon, too, I think, has written in the 13th or 14th book of his chronicle. What's different about Phlegon and Thallus is that we might actually have Phlegon's original wording. Eusebius, an early church historian, wrote a historical work called Chronicle. This original was lost, but was preserved in later works, including Jerome's Latin translation. The supposed quote by Phlegon goes like this: "However, in the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad, an eclipse of the sun happened, greater and more excellent than any that had happened before it. At the 6th hour, day turned into night, so that the stars were seen in the sky, and an earthquake in Bithynia toppled many buildings of the city of Nicaea." Phlegon doesn't mention Jesus at all, at least not here. At best, so far, he has confirmed a secondary detail. There are 2 additional places where Origen mentions Phlegon. Those are: now, Phlegon in the 13th or 14th book, I think, of his chronicles, not only ascribed to Jesus a knowledge of future events, although falling into confusion about some things which refer to Peter as if they refer to Jesus, but also testified that the result corresponded to his predictions. In other words, he accurately predicted the future. Origen's text has been preserved, so this quote passes the test of transmission. But since we don't have Phlegon's original wording or context, we don't know what he actually said, even though it kind of seems pretty obvious. I'm not a historian, Mac. Even though it kind of seems pretty obvious, but I'm not a historian. Origen doesn't seem too sure of the reference either, and it doesn't seem that he had them in front of him. Hence why this isn't the best source for the historical Jesus. Worth mentioning Phlegon though, even just for this last and best quote. We have in the preceding pages made our defense according to our ability, adducing the testimony of Phlegon, who relates that these events took place at the time when our Saviour suffered. And he goes on to say that Jesus, while alive, was of no assistance to himself, but that he arose after death, and exhibited the marks of his punishment, and showed how his hands had been pierced by nails. Phlegon mentions Jesus by name, along with his resurrection, the resurrection appearances, and crucifixion, all the way around. And that's why I've included him. The other quotes, by inference, I conclude, are Phlegon talking, referring to Jesus, even though in those other ones he doesn't mention him by name. Pliny the dusty Ute. Pliny the Younger. He was a lawyer, an author, a magistrate. He reputable. He writes a letter to the Emperor Trajan about the Christians, in which he asks for advice on how to deal with them. In this letter we gain further insights into the early Christians, what they practiced, what they believed, and we thereby understand more of this Jesus character. This a long one. It is my rule, sir, to refer to you all matters of which I am unsure. For who is more capable of guiding my uncertainty or informing my ignorance? Having never been present at any trials of the Christians, I am unacquainted with the method and limits to be observed, either in examining or punishing them. I have also been in great doubt whether any difference is to be made on account of age, or any distinction allowed between the youngest and the adult, whether recanting allows a pardon, or whether if a man has been once a Christian, it does not help him to recant, whether the mere profession of Christianity, albeit without crimes, or only the crimes associated with it, are punishable. In the meanwhile, the method I have observed towards those who have been denounced to me as Christians is this. I interrogated them whether they were Christians. If they confessed it, I repeated the question a second and a third time, adding the threat of capital punishment. If they still persevered, I ordered them to be led off to execution. For whatever the nature of their belief might be, I could at least feel no doubt that stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy deserved punishment. There were others also possessed with the same madness, but being citizens of Rome, I directed them to be sent there. These accusations spread, as is usually the case, from the mere fact of the matter being investigated, and several forms of the mischief came to light. A placard was put up without any signature, accusing a large number of persons by name. Snake! Those who denied that they were or ever had been Christians, who repeated after me an invocation to the gods and offered adoration with wine and incense to your statue, which I had ordered to be brought for this purpose, together with the images of the gods, and who finally cursed Christ. All things, it is said, that no real Christian can be forced to do. I thought they should be discharged. Others who were named by that informer at first confessed themselves Christians, but soon after denied it, saying that they had been, but they had ceased, some 3 years ago, others many years ago, and a few as much as 20 years ago. They all worshipped your statue, and the images of the gods, and cursed Christ. They affirmed, however, the whole of their guilt or error was that they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day, before it was light, and of singing in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a god, and of binding themselves by a solemn oath not to do wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor to deny a pledge when they were called upon to deliver it up. After this, it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. Even this practice, however, they had abandoned after the publication of my edict, by which, according to your orders, I had forbidden political associations. I therefore thought it the more necessary to extract the real truth with the assistance of torture from 2 female slaves, who were called deaconesses. But I could discover nothing more than depraved and excessive superstition. I have therefore adjourned the proceedings as hastened to consult you, for the matter seemed to me well worth referring to you, especially considering the numbers endangered. Many persons of all ages and ranks and of both sexes are being, and will be, called to trial. For this contagious superstition is not confined only to the cities, but is also spread through the villages and rural districts. Yada 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 yada. Probably could have yada yada a bit earlier. We see here certain early beliefs that Christians held, that Christians still hold, and according to an unfriendly witness, they sang and worshipped Christ as God, hence the capital punishment. We see some of the moral teachings of Jesus reflected here in the early church. Now, this is good stuff. Again, we have corroborating data from external pagan sources affirming what we can read in the eyewitness testimonies, the Gospels. Josephus. One of the most remarkable references to Jesus outside the Bible is found in the writings of Flavius Josephus. Josephus was a 1st century Jewish historian. In his Jewish Antiquities, he mentions Jesus. He describes the condemnation of one James by the Jewish Sanhedrin, who was, Josephus says, the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ. This agrees with Paul's description of James as the Lord's brother. There's an even earlier reference. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he wrought surprising feats. He was the Christ. When Pilate condemned him to be crucified, those who had come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the 3rd day he appeared, restored to life, and the tribe of Christians has not disappeared. Most scholars think the core of the passage originated from Josephus, but that it was later altered by a Christian editor, possibly between the 3rd and 4th century. The reason they think this is because Josephus wasn't a Christian, and some of the statements that we read there are quite Christian. The claim that Jesus was a wise man seems authentic. We've already read that elsewhere, that he's referred to as wise. But the qualifying phrase, if indeed one ought to call him a man, is suspect. It implies that Jesus is more than human. It's unlikely that Josephus believed that. It's also unlikely that he would have flatly asserted Jesus was the Christ, especially since he later refers to him as the so-called Christ. And finally, the claim that on the 3rd day Jesus appeared to his disciples, restored to life, inasmuch as it affirms Jesus' resurrection, is quite unlikely to have come from a non-Christian. But even if we disregard these questionable parts, we're still left with a good deal of corroborating information. We read that he was a wise man who performed surprising feats or miracles, and that although he was crucified under Pilate, his followers continued their discipleship and they became known as Christians. When we combine these statements with Josephus's later reference to the so-called Christ, or Jesus as the so-called Christ, a detailed picture emerges, one that is in harmony with the biblical record. The biblical Jesus seems to be one and the same with the historical Jesus. Let's move to the Babylonian Talmud. There are a few clear references to Jesus in this collection of Jewish rabbinical writings. The most significant: on the eve of Passover, Yeshua was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald cried, "He is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy." Let's look at it. He refers to someone named Yeshua. Yeshua is how Jesus' name is pronounced in Hebrew, or Yeshua, Yoshua. What does it mean by Jesus was hanged? New Testament says he was crucified. The term hanged can function as a synonym of crucified. For instance, Galatians 3:13 declares that Christ was hanged. Luke 23:39 applies this term to the criminals who were crucified alongside Jesus. So, the Talmud declares that Jesus was crucified on the eve of Passover. But what about the herald who was crying out that he was going to be stoned? This might simply indicate what the Jewish leaders had planned to do. If so, Roman involvement would have changed those plans. This passage also tells us why he was executed. It claims that he practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. This accusation comes from a rather hostile source. So it's not a shocker that Jesus is described as a sorcerer and a blasphemer. But if we make allowances for that, what do these charges imply about Jesus? Both accusations have strong parallels with the canonical Gospels. The charge of sorcery is similar to the Pharisees' accusation that Jesus cast out demons by the ruler of the demons. Don't think they thought that one through. Such a charge actually tends to confirm the claim that Jesus performed miracles. Jesus' miracles were too well attested to deny. The only alternative was to ascribe them to sorcery, to explain them away, kind of like the explaining away of why the empty tomb was empty. They couldn't flat out deny the body wasn't there, because if it wasn't there, it wasn't there, and if it was there, they could just go and see. But it wasn't there. Explain it some other way. Likewise, the charge of enticing Israel to apostasy is similar to Luke's account. The Jewish leaders accused Jesus of, misleading the nation with his teaching. This corroborates the New Testament. This corroborates the New Testament account of Jesus' strong teaching ministry. If read carefully, objectively, the Talmud, while it obviously doesn't support the Christian faith, it affirms much of the New Testament knowledge we have about Jesus. And finally, Lucian. Lucian was a 2nd century Greek satirist. In one of his works, he wrote of the early Christians. The Christians worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. It was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. Although Lucian is jesting, he makes significant comments that we've heard before. He says that Christians worshipped a man who introduced their novel rites, and though this man's followers thought highly of him, he angered his contemporaries with his teachings, so much so that he was crucified on that account. Although Lucian doesn't mention his name, clearly talking about Jesus. And according to Lucian, Jesus taught that all men are brothers at the moment of conversion. Well, that seems nice. But what did conversion involve? Denying the Greek gods, worshipping Jesus, living according to his teachings. Not a shocker then that he was killed for it. Lucian doesn't say so explicitly, but the Christians' denial of other gods, together with their worship of Jesus, implies the belief that Jesus was more than human, since they denied other gods in order to worship him. Apparently they thought Jesus was greater than the Greek gods. All that without ever having to open a Bible. This is the historical Jesus. The without using the Bible Jesus. The bare minimum Jesus. The everything but the eyewitness accounts Jesus. Jesus was a real man. He was wise and taught an exceedingly high moral code. He developed a massive following, whom he instructed to live with the same virtue he exhibited. Also, he was more than a moral teacher. He seemed to possess magical powers. He accurately predicted the future. He was supernatural. His followers worshipped him as a god. He was prosecuted and crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. At his execution, there was darkness and earthquaking. Jesus' followers reported seeing him bodily after he had died, 3 days after his crucifixion, and Jesus exhibited his wounds. His followers believed this proved he was the Messiah, and they held that belief in his deity, even though it meant their brutal persecution, and they still do. I hope this selection of ancient non-Christian sources helps you and reveals that history corroborates with our knowledge of Jesus from the Gospels, all from people who couldn't care less about Christian anything. People, causes, agendas. What's more, literally thousands of 1st century Christians gave their lives as martyrs for faith in Jesus. No one dies for what they know is a lie. Okay, bye.